are listening to Diagnosing TV, where we will talk about medicine through the lens of different TV shows and decide whether they took too much artistic license or they have a license to practice. Hello listeners, my name is Madhu Karthikeyan. Thank you for joining me here today on our first episode of Diagnosing TV. I wanted to create a podcast where I could talk about my two favorite loves, medicine and TV shows. So throughout the show, my goal will be to extract medical stories that run through some of my favorite TV shows and understand, with the help of some experts in the field, if the show is successful in portraying these medical stories or did it take too much artistic license. On this episode, we're going to be digging into the show The Queen's Gambit, one of my favorite shows of 2020. To help me pick apart the medical facts and give us the real story, I have a guest on here today, Dr. Divya Venkat. She's a physician in Pittsburgh, PA, interested in substance abuse disorders and healthcare delivery. She also loves Netflix and can be found on her couch binge-watching the newest shows on TV with her puppy, which makes her a perfect guest for this show. So before we get started and proceed with the rest of the show, I just wanted to put out a spoiler alert on the entire Queen's Gambit series because we will be talking about it in its entirety. I would also like to place a trigger warning because we will be talking about suicide, substance abuse, and domestic violence. So The Queen's Gambit, let's get into it. A quick summary. The Queen's Gambit is about a young girl named Beth Harmon, and the show starts off with Beth climbing hastily out of a bathtub, and she is late for a really important chess tournament. You then flash back to how Beth loses her mom and ends up in an orphanage where she gets introduced to drugs and the game of chess. You watch as Beth navigates the chess world as a woman among a sea of men, and you see her addiction evolve along with her sense of self and her love of chess. The limited series follows a tight character arc with beautiful sets, costumes, and life lessons. We learn that Beth is incredibly talented and becomes one of the greatest chess players, but behind the scenes, she struggles with drugs, alcohol, and maintaining healthy relationships. So that was kind of my take on it. What was your first impression of the show, those first couple of scenes, and what you thought of it in its entirety?
I think when I was a little surprised by the show because I wasn't really I didn't know what to expect when I started it. And I think Netflix has done a good job of making a lot more like artistic shows. I feel like there was a time when I think before like Stranger Things, it was a lot more kind of cliche cookie cutter television where you didn't it was pretty obvious what was going to happen. But I feel like the Queen's Gambit, when I heard about it, I heard it was about chess, which I was really excited about. My brother really liked chess growing up. My dad really liked chess growing up. So I was like, oh, this is something that I might be able to relate to. And when I started it, I was like, wait, this is not about chess. Like, this is about a lot of things that I deal with, right? Like things like substance use disorders, childhood trauma, how they interplay and then make the kind of person that they are today. And so I thought it was a really good show. I thought it was really interesting how they weaved all those elements together and how they kind of show that someone's success is not totally dependent on the way that they're raised, which is, I think, a pretty common notion amongst most people. And that childhood trauma can also create genius, which I think we see a lot with our current pop culture.
Yeah, that's so true. One of my favorite tropes that TV shows that I like do is that you don't really know where they're going to end up. And you kind of see in the first scene that she is so out of sorts. You almost think that that's the present, like that's going to be kind of the ending of the show. And they're leading up to basically like a spiral instead of leading up to
Hmm.
like that redemption. So yeah, absolutely. I thought they did a great job. I do love the character arcs in this show. So let's start with her early trauma. Like you mentioned, her mom did get into that car crash in the beginning, but prior to that, she kind of has like this fight with her husband at the time and Beth's dad, and it's kind of insinuated that they have an abusive relationship. It's not outright said, but it's kind of insinuated, and the dad is shown abandoning the family, and they get in the car, and she kind of tells Beth to kind of close her eyes and not pay attention. And like I said before, one of my favorite things is that shows don't really tell the audience what they're doing and kind of let us interpret. But I kind of saw that scene as like almost like she was trying to take them both out because she just felt like their lives weren't worth living anymore. This was time for them to go. Did you feel like that, or did you feel like a lot of other people thought it was just her committing suicide?
I don't know that. I honestly don't even know. I think that when people end up in that kind of situation, um, I don't know that people really think about what the end result is going to be. Do you know what I mean? I think that when you have undergone that much trauma and that much suffering, I think it's pretty easy to just feel like you need to do something that's going to fix anything, right?
Yeah.
And I can't imagine being a mother in that situation when you feel like you brought a child into this world and you know that that child is suffering because of, you feel like the child is suffering because of what your decisions were.
Right, her
And I think in that
actions.
moment, yeah, and I think in that moment, all she wanted to do was help them both out and whatever that was, right? I don't know that Beth's mom like really thought about it. Doesn't, they don't make it obvious that she was really contemplating suicide or
Right.
that they were thinking about that. I think what they make obvious is that like she was just trying to do anything to make the situation better.
Better.
And in that moment, all she could think about was driving as fast as she could, you
Right.
know?
Running away from her problems.
Yeah, or trying to come up with a solution that felt like there when there was no solution at all.
Absolutely. So, and then there's this stark image of Beth kind of standing on that road all by herself, surrounded by this chaos. And then she's suddenly taken to this orphanage, um, where it's a very regimented schedule. And we'll get into like kind of how the orphanage is set up a little bit later, but it's very a weird it's pretty weird environment. And one of the things is that they kind of line up the children at like a certain point in the day to kind of get drugs, and one of the drugs is a tranquilizer. The evolution of drugs is so crazy. We have learned so much about drugs as we do more and more research, and there's a large history of giving people drugs that they definitely should not have been taking. So were you surprised that children were given basically what they considered were tranquilizers at this time?
No, I mean, I think that the TV show kind of took place in an era where we didn't really understand the effects of drugs, you know? For example, like no one really understood cocaine when it came out, and now it's we know that crack
Yeah.
cocaine is a highly addictive substance, right? Same thing
Hmm.
with tranquilizers. Like there was a time when people would just take their what like Quaaludes, and it was a
Right.
pretty normal thing that people took. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing is that we know that these things become addictive now, and I think that
Right.
that's why Netflix probably portrayed it this way. They portrayed it in a time when they're like, yeah, drugs were given to these kids at this time, and no one knew that they were addictive. But now, as a present viewer, I can tell you that that was probably an addictive substance, right? And we see addiction
Right.
kind of play out. Um, I'm not totally surprised because I think that honestly, back then, people got drugs for all sorts of reasons, but we didn't understand drugs enough to know that they were addictive. You know,
Right. Right.
same thing with like opium. Same kind of I would say same kind of character arc happened for opioids. You know what I
Right.
mean?
We're still learning so much about what that did to our current state in healthcare.
Hmm.
Uh, a little bit after Beth was given those, her friend Jolene, who she met at the orphanage, does tell her kind of, oh, just be careful, you might get withdrawal symptoms, you might experience something like this. And it's almost like Jolene kind of knows, it's almost as if Jolene is not controlled by the drugs. It's almost like she's taking it, but she understands what the side effects are. But Beth, on the other hand, is being introduced to it, and she's kind of being taken over by this almost at the start of her addiction. Um, but when they eventually do catch up with the research and they remove the tranquilizers, they're still given other drugs, but they're no longer giving her the green pills. Um, and she goes through withdrawal symptoms. Did you think it was weird that the other children weren't going through withdrawal symptoms, or it was just not preview to us?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really clear. They didn't really, other than Jolene, they didn't really show us the other children that much. So we don't really know what kind of symptoms they're going through. I think that's the thing that we have to understand about addiction is, first of all, Jolene was pocketing the pills, right? Like she wasn't taking
Yes.
them regularly.
Right.
But we know that our main character was definitely taking them regularly. Like she was definitely taking them overly regularly. Like she tried to make sure that she had extra sometimes, right? Like
Right. Right.
that was her trajectory. And I think that's the thing we have to think about when we think about addiction. It's not substance use disorders can affect anyone. You don't need to have a history of trauma. You don't need to have like this really tortured past to have an issue with a substance use disorder. We know that people who have issues with trauma might be more, um, might have a predilection for this because of, trying to deal with other things. but not everyone's going to be affected by it in the same way, and that has to do a lot with our like our chemistry, right? Like our biology and the way our like neurological pathways kind of play into addiction. And those are things that we don't know yet. I can't tell you that I could give 5 people oxys, right? Like oxycodone, and like maybe one of those people is going to have a substance use disorders after that, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
just based on their biology, but we don't know that much about that yet. I
Right.
think for Beth, I think it was a number of things, you know what I mean? I think that she was trying to escape. Like it's so obvious throughout the show, like she's just trying to escape constantly. She's trying to escape her own life and get into her head in a way that like allows her to live. And that's kind of how she got found in chess. She was trying to
Right.
find a way to like make sense of what was going on. She was trying to escape the orphanage. And so she found tranquilizers, and it was also kind of a thing that she was forced to take, right? And she started
Easily
taking them,
accessible.
easily accessible, and she was kind of able to find a path in there that was obviously not good for her,
Mm-hmm.
but she didn't have the kind of insight, and she didn't have a situation where she was really able to see past that. And I think that's what's really important to think about when we think about substance use disorders. It's so easy to blame the person who has a substance use disorder, but none of us know what someone's gone through to get to that position, right? And so when we think about Beth and like kind of like how everyone later on in the show is kind of like judging her for having multiple substance use disorders,
Right.
whether it was like tranquilizers, whether it was alcohol. I think she uses some other drugs at some point. Everyone's judging her and they're like, oh, well, you're crazy, you're doing all these things. But substance use disorders are so deep within us. And that's why like things
Right.
like treatment options have to also be more comprehensive. And we have to think about the idea that people need to be met where they are in their
Mm-hmm.
substance use disorder versus like there's no cookie cutter way to treat a substance use disorder because you're treating a human.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was actually going to touch upon her trauma as well. And you said, like, we can never predict if somebody does go down the path of addiction. But trauma in this show is shown that she is the only character, or as we're seeing, has this really incredible trauma coming right before she enters the orphanage. Unlike Jolene, who's been there for a while. We don't know. She might also have a lot of trauma. A lot of these kids, I mean, they've lost their parents, so they probably have trauma in their past. But we see that. Do we think that this heightened withdrawal and predisposition to addiction is because of that trauma? Or are you saying that maybe even if they have this, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go through addiction?
Yeah, I don't think that we can really relate the two. I think that we can assume that everyone that was in that orphanage had a significant amount of trauma. Like imagine Jolene, like she sat there so many years not being able to
Mm-hmm.
be adopted, and they kind of discuss how it might be due to her race, which is
Right.
even more traumatizing, right? Like she has
Yes.
no one during all these times. Like she's just constantly left, constantly abandoned, and she doesn't seem to develop a substance use disorder. I don't think we can relate her having I don't think we can relate Beth having a substance use disorder necessarily to the fact directly that she has trauma, but we do know that trauma can lead trauma can play a heavy amount into substance use disorder. Like a lot of my patients will kind of tell me like, hey, one reason I kind of got into drugs is because I was trying to this really terrible thing happened to me. This is how I dealt with it.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't say that for everyone. We can't say that for every person with substance use disorder that trauma is a huge part of it. I think for Beth, her substance use disorder definitely like trauma is a huge part of it, but I don't think that's like every patient. And I think that almost everyone who was in that orphanage definitely had trauma,
Right.
just
Right.
based on how they were running the orphanage, based on the way that adoption looked like it was happening, where it was like really 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 young kids are the ones who are being able to leave. There was quite a few older kids who were not being able to get adopted at that point too. So
That's a great point. You also talk about meeting people where they are. Um, when these kids are taking off these tranquilizers, do you think because they're so young, so impressionable, having this drug introduced to them so young, that must have really impacted how they dealt with it? And do you think that maybe having an intervention at this point would have really helped the kids and especially Beth rather than waiting for this addiction to evolve and grow and let her get addicted to maybe alcohol as well and add on to that that drug addiction? Do you think that intervention right here at this point would have been the best case scenario?
I mean, I think that just like the whole way that the orphanage is run was there needed to be an intervention on that, right? Like, why do they
Mm-hmm.
even need tranquilizers? Like, why are they being given tranquilizers? And it's because like if you think about um a lot of the different structures within our society, even now, right? Nothing is rehabilitative, right? Like
Right.
incarceration is not rehabilitative, orphanages are not rehabilitative, foster homes are not rehabilitative, right?
Right. It's
We've
almost
never,
like you're keeping people in line rather than trying to teach them how to get through life.
exactly. And I think this is just like an example of that, right? So yeah, maybe like there should have been some type of intervention to help people who are going to develop a substance use disorder. But larger than that, we like they put these kids in a situation where it almost is like they knew that this was a bad environment. They knew that this was going to be harmful to these kids. So they give them tranquilizers because they know that it's going to calm them down. No one was giving these kids tranquilizers because like they thought it was going to make them like geniuses. They thought they were going to give them tranquilizers so that way they didn't act out of line, right? So
Yeah.
many of their constructs right now in society are really based on keeping people in line and not really allowing for rehabilitative causes. So even from the beginning, when we think about foster care and we think about orphanages, we really should be thinking about how do we create systems that allow for people to grow and get better and flourish. And I'm not saying every orphanage is like that. I mean, I think
Right.
that again, I'm thinking about an orphanage in a very general way as pertains to the show. And maybe orphanages are changing, right? Just like school
Hmm.
systems are trying to change a little bit. But if we start thinking about how we can make these systems more rehabilitative, then maybe people, maybe drugs wouldn't become such a thing because we could actually catch people before they fall, you
Right.
know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And Jolene gives us a lot of insight into how the orphanage was. Even when we saw it, I feel like we were like, oh, these kids are just they're getting TV shows, they're getting movies, they're getting food, they're getting a bed to sleep in. But when she comes back in the show later on in the series, we really see how much it impacted her, and we're definitely gonna analyze how her character comes into things when we talk about Beth's different relationships. So the orphanage is also the first place that we see Beth kind of with her superhero abilities of visualizing that chessboard on the ceiling. And she gets that ability, I believe, right after her first dose of that tranquilizer. And so, do you think that? And this kind of gets a little bit explained at the end of the show, but do you think that it has to do more with her IQ, her natural ability, her talent that she's able to visualize this board, or do you think it was because of that brain altering substance?
I mean, I think it was probably because of her talents. I mean, I think it's like when people take Adderall to stay up all night to study, right? Like that's something that's not uncommon. Obviously, it's not something that is a good thing, but people do it.
Hmm.
And so we were like, we can't really, it's difficult to say that a person is really smart because they took Adderall, right?
Right.
It's just like it's a way to expedite the process. And so when you think about Quaaludes, they're sedatives, but they also like kind of like hype up your imagination a little bit. So maybe they played into it, but I think a lot of it had to do with their own natural talents
Yeah.
versus like when people take cocaine and they're like, yeah, I'm so much more fun on cocaine. No, your person is the same person. It's just that you lose inhibition, right? And so
Right.
that's what a lot of drugs do is you lose inhibition or it hypes you up in a way that you might not be as normal as in your everyday life. But it doesn't mean that that's a different part of who you are. That's just a different part of who you are enhanced, you know? So that's
Yeah.
kind of how I think about her on Quaaludes and looking at a chessboard.
Yeah. But I do think it kind of plays into her idea that she needs this substance.
Hmm.
I think like a lot of people, like you said, Adderall, once, okay, let's say you get that A or let's say you've been getting a pretty decent grade in the class, but then you get that A after that Adderall session and you're like, oh, I need this now, Now the next time you're going to be like, I got that A last time, I'm going to do it this time. And I think it does play into that. She's like, I can only see this board and I can only visualize the chess when I'm on this substance. So that must mean that it's good for me. That must mean that I need it. Um, and this kind of leads into one of the first climaxes in the show. It has a couple of climaxes, and one of them is in this orphanage, or when it comes to like around the end of her time in the orphanage, when she breaks into the medical wing and tries to basically acquire so many pills that she overdoses. Uh, Now, I kind of want to address the idea of a bottom because I think the show kind of aligns its climaxes or its mini climaxes with her quote unquote bottoms. And um, what I love about the show is that it doesn't really have just one bottom. It kind of makes you understand that a bottom is not just like this lowest case that you're just hitting rock bottom, but it's more like an inflection point. And unless you understand and make the choice that it's not what you want anymore, it's not going to change. And I think I kind of learned that when I was talking to a lot of people who went through AA, and they were talking about there's really no idea of a bottom. It's just when you decide to get back up and you're like, I'm going to change this. I'm just going to make that choice. Do you think that's accurate with the patients that you've worked with?
I think that's the one thing I don't like about this show is I think how they portray substance use disorders, because I think they make it look like this thing where people just keep doing it because they keep doing it. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And I don't think people keep doing things because they want to keep doing things. Like
Right.
no one is like 5 years old and wakes up and is like, I want to one day be addicted to heroin. No one feels like that, right? And I think that they make it seem like, oh yeah, so she keeps hitting these quote unquote bottoms, and because of that, she just has to keep bouncing back. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
when I talk to my patients about a bottom, I don't like to think of it as a bottom because we're telling them that they have reached a point that other humans do not reach, right? You're
Right.
basically making someone feel like they don't have the ability to be like everyone else, which is wrong. We're all humans. And I think that what they're dealing with is probably just a lot harder than what most people deal with on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think of things like recovery, I think of it as a lot of people, as I think as lay people, we like to think of addiction and we like to think of, we call it recovery, but I like to think about it like as staying off of drugs. We like to think about it as like a linear process, right? Or like an up, down linear
Right.
process. But that's like not what this is. Because when you're taking drugs and when you're addicted to a substance, your life is not linear. Our lives are not linear, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you on a day-to-day basis, like some days I'll be like, I'm gonna eat really, really healthy, and some days I eat really, really terribly. And I keep going back and forth. But do I call that my bottom? No, I don't
Right.
call that my bottom. I call that my life. Like I call that like
Right.
I'm a human and sometimes I don't eat well, right? But that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly how we have to think about things, people with a substance use disorder. Recovery and getting off of drugs is not linear, it's a journey, right? And
Mm-hmm.
every day is a new challenge, every day is a new thing. And sometimes I wish in this show they'd explore a little bit more about how she dealt with her trauma and why that played such a huge part in her substance use disorder. It's easy to see someone spiral, and I think that's how we get a lot of viewers is by watching people spiral and watching people struggle and kind of almost judging them for it, right? But if
Mm-hmm.
you think about Beth as a human and what she must have gone through to get off of drugs, that's remarkable,
Right.
and it's not just like about her being able to play chess, it's about the fact that what she had to go through to do it was incredible, you know
Yeah.
and so I think that when we think about bottoms and tops and how people peak and get better, if we define it that way, then we don't leave any room for error. Because if
Mm-hmm.
we're like, oh, you've only hit your bottom, we can't do this again, then that doesn't really make sense, right? Because people are
No.
going to sometimes get hurt, right? Sometimes people are going to return to use, and that's how life works for a lot of people. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine using heroin every day, suddenly stopping, having a really terrible day, and not wanting to use heroin again.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Right. Especially when you've used it as that, you know,
As your crutch.
mm-hmm,
Yeah,
for
like
so
what do we,
long.
I mean, things that I use as a crutch, I go to Taco Bell when I'm really upset, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's not good for me, and I know that, but I do it. And like
Right.
if someone told me like, oh, you can't go to Taco Bell, and that's my coping mechanism, and then suddenly like I'm having a really, really bad day and I can't go to Taco Bell, like
Right.
I'm probably gonna do it anyways.
Right. But there's always going to be that person be like, just have more self-control, just don't go to Taco Bell.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people think of drugs and drug use as self-control. And
Mm-hmm.
if it was just self-control, do you know how many people would have not overdosed?
Right.
So many people. No one wants to overdose. I know I talked to a lot of my patients about like, I talked to them a lot about like, oh, so like, we've started you on buprenorphine naloxone. Like, how has this changed your life? And they're like, well, it's really good, but it's hard. You know what I mean? It's hard to like change your life completely. These are people who have gone and used a substance every day of their lives, and we're suddenly telling them not to.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. You know what I mean? Like if someone told me to change my habits every day, that's like an impossible thing we're asking people to do. And we
Right.
don't ask people to change a lot of their behaviors. There's a lot of detrimental behaviors out there that we don't like judge people for and that we don't get mad at people for. But for some reason, when it comes to drugs, we decide that we're we know better than everyone else when I've
Mm.
never use heroin, so I don't know what that's like. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think that a lot of people want to use it like, yeah, just stop. Well, then maybe Americans should stop eating McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
If it was that easy, then why is our fast food industry booming, right?
Right. Right. So you briefly mentioned naloxone. Can you explain exactly what that's used for and how patients can benefit from it?
Yeah, buprenorphine naloxone is a medication that is prescribed for opioid use disorder. Buprenorphine is a partial opioid agonist, so basically it partially binds the same receptors that heroin does, or any type of like oxycodone, an opiate, basically. And it basically allows patients to not feel withdrawal symptoms, and somewhat treats their cravings as well. The naloxone is obviously the opioid reversal agent, so this comes in a film. The reason that naloxone is added is so that way people can't melt it and inject it and try to get high off of it because you'll immediately withdraw, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a good medication. I think a lot of patients benefit from it. It's pretty highly monitored by the government
Mm-hmm.
because there's concern for abuse potential, although I'm not sure that there really is, because it doesn't really, completely bind to the opioid receptor. But I see patients do really, really well on it. I prescribe it a lot, and I think a lot of my patients are very happy to be on the medication.
Okay, cool. So yeah, towards the end of her story in the orphanage, she has learned chess from Mr. Scheibel. Eventually, she meets her adoptive parents, and her parents, Alma and Alston, adopt her. And unfortunately, this doesn't go as quite as well as you wanted to. She gets this front row seat to another abusive relationship between her adoptive mother, Alma, and her adopted father, Alston. This is actually what I would think is a very common form of manipulation in abusive domestic relationships. He often downplays anything she likes, any of her successes, Alma's successes, and diminishes her love for playing the piano. And as a result, it makes her a pretty selfish parent. I mean, both of them are selfish, but I think her reason for it is because she is experiencing kind of this oppressive abuse from her partner. Would you agree with that? Is that what you saw between their relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems like they're not. Yeah, I think I would agree with you. It seems really like a like kind of gaslighting, making
Yeah.
her take the blame for things that are not necessarily her fault. And then because of that, she's kind of spiraling and doesn't really have a way to go out and kind of takes it out on Beth.
Yeah, and then eventually she does go get a prescription from the doctor for another, like I'm pretty sure it's the same drug.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm assuming this is a very highly prescribed drug because it's very highly accessible at this time period. And when she's gone to fill out the prescription for her, she's able to steal a few doses. Have you seen like this evolution of how like parents have become more vigilant about drugs at their homes and like kind of locking up the prescription cap or like their cabinets and such so teenagers don't get into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see that a lot more like on TV. Honestly, I don't really see that in my patient population because I think a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
patients are they kind of live like I don't know. I just like don't really hear about it as much when I think about my patients. But I think it's something that we see a lot on TV. I think that that idea of keeping things under lock and key is kind of coming under fire because really it should be about conversations, right? So if you are going to do it, how do we do it safely? And I think about that even when I think about my patients. A lot of my patients may return to use at some point.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I talk to them mostly about like, okay, if this may happen again, but how are we going to do it more safely this time? How are we going to make sure you don't overdose? And I think that's kind of how we have to think about even our children, how we raise our children around drugs and alcohol is this might be something that you end up doing, but how do we make sure that you do it in a more safe manner, you know?
That's so interesting that you say that because I feel like just as a third party observer, um, so much of the conversation about drugs and alcohol is don't do it. You know,
Yeah.
the just say no process that we've learned in elementary school or even for addicts. I feel like a lot of it is like the 12-step program, got to count the days that you haven't had this substance in, make sure you're keeping on track, and like a relapse, it's not great. It's harder to come back from a relapse than it is to come back from your starting point of sobriety. Like all I hear is the sense that just focus on not getting back into it. And that's so interesting that you point out that we have to equip patients with the ability to come back even from a relapse.
Yeah, and it's something that we like call harm reduction in medicine, which is basically just mitigating the harm. So like obviously people are going to do what they want to do, or they're going to end up doing what they want to do in that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what our job is every part of medicine, not just like things like substance use disorders, but even with like diabetes, with hypertension, with cardiovascular disease, with obesity, our job is to like equip people to make the best informed decision that they can in that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're going to do it, let's do it in the way that's safest for you. You know what I mean? And let's
Mm-hmm.
do it in a way that makes sense for you. Because I think, again, I can't expect people to make a big change suddenly, right? If
Right.
someone were to ask me to change one of my core behaviors suddenly, I would not take nicely to it. I'd probably be like, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, right? But if
Right.
someone brings it to me and like, hey, this behavior is a little bit concerning. What can we do to make that better for you? I'd probably be more willing to change, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's how we have to think about things like substance use disorders, and even with the way that we raise our children. I'm not saying that you encourage your kids to do drugs or drink alcohol or anything. It's totally up to you as a parent, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I think is that depending on the kind of household you live in, if you do have those things present, there is a good chance that your kids may use them at some point, right? So how do
Right.
we teach our kids to do it in a way that's safe? I think that that's what happens to a lot of kids is like they don't, we're in this culture where it's like, no, no, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Then you go to college and then people start partying like crazy, right? And they're drinking
Right.
way too much because they didn't do it in a graduated way, right? Or they
Right.
never had a conversation on how to do it properly. And so I think that's kind of how I view it is sure, like I obviously, when I have kids, I hope that we can raise them in a way that they don't feel the need to use drugs to escape from reality, or they don't feel like they need to use alcohol to escape from reality.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that happens. And if we are successful in that, I do want to have a conversation with them that's about, hey, like, how are we going to do this in a way that's safe and that's
Right.
okay for you? Do you know what I mean? And if you get
Yeah.
into trouble, how can I be there to support you? Um, so I think kind of what Beth goes through, no one really even knows, no one's talking to Beth, right? Like no one's even having a conversation with Beth about what is her trauma, like what has she gone through, you know what I mean? She's
Mm-hmm.
just so excited to be adopted that like
Right.
and I think that's exactly what we do. Like we think about how when we think about people who are marginalized, we're like, oh, well, you should just be happy with anything that you get, right? You should
Mm-hmm.
just be happy with like this random piece of clothing that you get. We're never going to ask you about anything else. You should just be happy that we've given you this many resources. And that's exactly what happens to Beth. They're just like, oh, well, you should just be happy. You should just be
Right.
really happy with what's going on. And it's actually pretty traumatizing for her, right? She's like
Mm-hmm.
seeing another marriage fall apart. You know what I mean? She's like on her own all the time. She's not getting an education, really. You know what I mean? And like when she
Yeah.
does, it's like kind of haphazard. It's not really good because no one's like sitting and actually talking to Beth about how she feels.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And she's kind of just
Sorry, that
so
was a rant, but
no.
anyways.
We love those rants. That's why we're talking about it. So that kind of wraps up like where we are plot wise. I kind of want to get into the relationships because Beth has a lot of interesting relationships, and as her addiction evolves, as her relationship with drugs and alcohol evolves, her relationships go through a hard time. She has a hard time maintaining really healthy relationships. Um, Her adopted mom, Alma, eventually uh, gets rid of her husband. Her husband's gone. Well, he leaves, and that does a lot for her. She kind of gets into this mode of like, no, I always wanted to be a mom, so at least let me do this job right. I want to do this well. And she encourages Beth to get involved in chess. And in the beginning, for sure, I was like, "Oh, why are you hyper focusing on all this money, Alma?" What it was really, I felt really skeptical towards her. I think the show did a great job of like having the audience feel really skeptical
Mm-hmm.
about Alma in the beginning. But she does kind of evolve a little bit. What do you say to people who might look at Alma and be like, well, she should have known that Beth was going through this. Like, it's partly her fault that you know, Beth was started to really get into drugs and alcohol specifically even more. And she was kind of doing it like around Alma. So what do you say to people who are like, it's part of their environment too? Like maybe people should be blamed around them.
I mean, I think that like I don't think Alma knew that she was also an alcoholic. Like she didn't even like if she'd had an alcohol use disorder, like she didn't even recognize that, right? Until she like
Mm-hmm.
died. She
Mm-hmm.
didn't really like she wasn't really like she did not acknowledge the fact that she had an alcohol use disorder.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that she did create a situation where Beth had to take care of her all the time. Like Beth was the caretaker. Beth was the mom.
Yes.
Beth
Mm-hmm.
was the one. Alma provided love, whatever
Mm-hmm.
that love was. She provided love, but that's about it. She didn't actually provide like being a mother to her.
Right.
And so I think
Financial
that
independence was not through Alma.
no, and like Alma basically was dependent on Beth. Alma was dependent on Beth for love. Beth was the one who was constantly like making her feel better about herself, making
Mm-hmm.
her feel more supported, making her feel like everything was going to be okay. You know, Beth like didn't have anyone doing that for her at all.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
I think that like I think that Alma did play a huge part in her substance use disorder.
Yeah.
I think it's not because like Beth needed a parent.
Yeah. And I think towards the very end, right before Alma died, I think Beth lost that tournament. And she goes to Alma and she's like, I'm so glad you weren't there to see me lose. And she's almost surprised that Alma's like totally fine with it. Like Alma does not
Yeah,
care that she didn't lose. And it's almost like Beth had not known until that point that her mom cared or didn't care whether she won that chess tournament.
exactly.
And it would have been really advantageous to her to have heard that earlier on and been like, no, I don't care. Let's just nurture your love for chess. I don't care if you win or
Yeah.
lose.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Beth like couldn't form like a healthy relationship with Jess because everyone around her made it seem like if she didn't do a good job, then it was bad, right? And we
Mm-hmm.
all know that if you go into any field like that, then like that's like a recipe for disaster. Not
Yeah.
many people survive in that kind of environment.
Well, I can tell you, I used to play chess a little bit when I was younger. I did like chess tournaments, and my anxiety got so much the better of me when I was younger. I actually quit chess. Oh God, like probably when I was like 12 or something. And I actually loved the game of chess. I just hated tournaments because of how anxiety inducing it was. And
Yeah.
I look back and I'm like, if someone had just told me that everybody else in that room was feeling anxious too, I think I would have been just fine.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
yeah. So according to my sleuthing, aka me just Googling, when Beth met Towns at that first tournament she ever registered in, she was 15 years old. Um, and the average adolescent gets their period when they're 12 years old. And I mention that because she gets her period um,
Hmm.
during this tournament. Uh, it's like the biggest nightmare for any little girl out there. But there is definitely a variation between individual to individual when they get their period, but 15 is significantly older than 12. Do you think that her development was stunted by the drugs and leading to this delay of her period?
No, because I think that people get their periods at all sorts of ages. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like sometimes people say that like depending on your nutritional status, you might get it later on in life. Like we see that sometimes in third world countries, but I don't think that's necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
I think the show wanted to be something that it maybe was not. You know,
Right. Yeah.
like I
I
think
mean,
people get it kind of at all varied ages.
yeah, I was very grateful I got it at home and did not have to be in public for it
Yeah,
because I think I would have
same.
just, I had no idea what it was, so I would have just been like out of sorts. All right. And then we transition to Benny, who's also initially her opponent and then becomes a sort of mentor. And he's the first one to confront Beth about the rumors that she is an addict and gives her kind of this ultimatum, which is essentially, I'll mentor you. I know that you want to beat the Russians. I've I've tried to beat the Russians. I have the most experience with the Russians as anyone, and so I can mentor you. You're obviously smarter than me, but I can mentor you helping with the tactics that I think you need to beat the Russians. But I have one ultimatum, which is don't drink. And this kind of intervention kind of seems a little stark. It's going pretty much cold turkey for her. Um, when and what kind of intervention would have been the most effective? Because I don't think this part was super realistic. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, like knowing what we know about alcohol, you can't really stop cold turkey. Otherwise, you get super sick and it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like based on where she was in her use disorder, I think this is what she needed. You know what I mean? Because he
Mm-hmm.
kind of like he kind of acknowledged that it existed, but like he didn't put it on the spot. I think that, when I think about people, I don't, this is not a sustainable intervention, right? It is a intervention. I think that when it comes to someone who has a substance use disorder, you want to actually talk to them about what's going on. You know what I mean? No one's
Yes.
talked to Beth at this point really about like, hey, something's going on. Like, do you feel like you drink a lot? And I think that's part of the issue is like she hasn't really had anyone that's she's trusted enough, right? With
Mm-hmm.
Benny, she's just really trying to like learn how to play chess. She doesn't
Right.
care about him outside of that, right? Like she's like okay about him. At some point, maybe like a little bit of romantic feelings, whatever, but she's not really like
Right.
invested in him. So I don't think there's ever been someone in her life where she's really been like, oh yeah, this is like who she would have taken it great from. I think maybe talking about it more would have been better, but I think for what the relationship was and what had to happen, I think it was okay. You
Right.
know?
Right. Right. And so maybe like as a hypothetical, as a friend of somebody who might be going through something, you would recommend like me reaching out to the friend and being like, "Hey, I've noticed this, this, and this. Do you think that we need to combat it because it seems like you're going down a more harmful path?" Is that what you would recommend as an intervention?
Usually I think when we talk to people about what they're going through, I think it's best not to label anything. I usually just say, I've noticed like you drink a lot. How do you feel about that?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
make it reflexive, make them think about what they're going through. You know what I mean?
Right.
And if they don't feel like it'd be like, well, like, and then, if they're like, no, there's nothing going on, I'd be like, okay, well, I'm personally concerned about it. But first, I'd really ask the person from their perspective how things are going. Like,
Right.
how do you feel about what's going on in your life? You know what I mean? Versus
Mm-hmm.
me coming at it. Because I think the minute that you label something, it automatically shows which side you're on, right? And I think
Yeah.
with, and I think that no one likes to receive criticism.
Yeah.
No one likes to be told what they're doing is wrong or right. We all like to believe we're good people that do the right thing most of the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think if you approach it like, hey, this is I've noticed this, like, how do you feel about this? Like, is this something you've noticed too? They say no, be like, okay, then you can assign your value, right? Be like, hey, I'm concerned about it. This seems like it might not be you, or this is hurting you in some way. Um, can we talk about it? And then if they're ready to talk about it, then talk about it. I think that's the thing is like people also have to be wanting to change. We can't change people just because we decide that it's a bad behavior,
Right.
or we assign it a negative quality. What we can do is just tell people like we care and that we're there for them, and that when
Mm-hmm.
they're ready to talk about it, we're there for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's excellent points. So then we go into where Benny's trying to train her, and it kind of does work. Like his ultimatum kind of does work because she's like, I really want to get good at chess, and like Benny is so into chess, and then she kind of gets introduced to Cleo, and Cleo is like the first female character besides Jolene that she meets, and is she's kind of enamored by her beauty, by her like physicality, by everything that Cleo is. She has nothing to do with chess, but she's kind of like loves her outlook on life and kind of like the way that Cleo lives her life. But she does kind of initiate Beth's path back to alcohol because right before that huge tournament with Borgov, um, Cleo invites her on a night out, and Beth has been really good about staying away from alcohol, staying away from drugs. She's very focused on this new chess tournament. And at the very end of it, she gets with Cleo and starts drinking again. Um, what did you think about her relationship with Cleo? What did you think that was going on between them?
I think like for Beth, and that's what I mean. I think Beth's never really sorted through her feelings, and I think Beth has always wanted to be carefree, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Beth has lived in her head for so long. Beth has always had to worry about things. Beth has always had to like try to find escapist routes out of what her reality is. And so she uses chess a lot. She uses all these other modes to get out of it, right? But then to
Mm-hmm.
see someone who doesn't have to escape their reality, that their reality is something that they want to be in, I think that's like a really, really exciting thing for Beth, right? Like she doesn't like Cleo is this person who can still live in her reality and be who she is and doesn't have to worry about it. There's so
Mm-hmm.
many times where you hear Beth doesn't understand her sexuality at some point, right? Like Beth is
Yeah.
like trying to figure out like, oh, like do I like sex? Do I not like sex? Like what is
Right.
that? How do I relate to boys? Like, what does that mean? Do I relate to girls? Like, I'm not really sure, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so that's one aspect of it. So here's Cleo, and she's able to embrace her sexuality in its fullest, right? And not
Mm-hmm.
just her sexuality, but her personality. At this point, Beth, there's so many times where Beth like appears awkward. Like she doesn't look like
Yeah.
she's comfortable in her own skin. She doesn't know her personality. She doesn't know what her like she likes. She doesn't really know what she dislikes. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes you see that she's just kind of molding into the people around her or trying to do things to please them, not
Right.
really coming up with the only thing that we know that she likes is chess. And even then there's like the stress around chess, right? Around
Yeah.
chess.
It's interesting because she does take a lot of time to like curate her looks. You know, she really
Yeah.
does put a lot of effort into her outfits, but she doesn't talk about it. She doesn't talk about these things with Cleo either, like about how what what she likes outside of chess. She doesn't really talk about with Cleo either, but you can see as an audience, oh, but she really does like fashion. She really does. You see
Mm-hmm.
her fashion evolve throughout the time, and she does have other interests, but she's really doesn't just talk about them. I think she just doesn't know how to embrace those sides of her.
Yeah. But Cleo does. And Cleo is like this person who like represents everything that Beth has ever wanted, which is
Mm-hmm.
like freedom.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the very last relationship we're going to talk about is her one with Jolene. And Jolene comes in the very beginning and then almost at the very end again. And she gives us a lot of insight into how the the orphanage was, what her experience was, because we never really got her point of view in the beginning. There is something here to highlight though, and in an almost all white cast, Jolene is the only black member. And there were some articles written about how Jolene is reduced to like this magical black character trope, where basically, what do I mean by that? Well, it's a trope of supporting black characters who come to the aid of a white protagonist in a film or TV show. And too often, black characters are placed in this role. And Jolene, even you can see this from the beginning, she kind of aids Beth's journey throughout the orphanage. She isn't adopted because of many factors. One is it is kind of insinuated that it might be her race, definitely older age. And then later on in life, she even funds Beth's way to Russia. So I think it does kind of reflect, though, the time of an era of this show where like black people are often put in the sidelines and kind of expected to prop up the white characters. Did you feel like that? Because you had mentioned something like that in our earlier discussion too.
Yeah, I mean, I think they I think it's complicated because I think of when like the show is what the era it's supposed to be reflecting. And
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I really commend the show on doing is I think there's a lot of shows who just naturally have um like characters who are black be the one who's actually the one who's addicted to drugs. And I feel like they
Mm,
reversed that, right? And I thought that was really, really good. I'm like, yes,
that
like
is,
that's
yeah.
correct. Like you shouldn't because this is a disease that affects everyone. And so often we assign it to a specific ethnicity and there are certain like populations where like, yeah, they're the only ones who have a substance use disorder. So I think they do a good
Right.
job of that. I hear what you're saying though. I didn't really think of it that way. I didn't really think about how her race played into how like Beth perceived her because I felt like it
Yeah.
just showed that Beth had someone in her life. Do you know what I mean?
I don't
I
think
think
Beth
what her
saw that, no.
and I think what her race did in the show was just show that like here was this person who was never going to get adopted because of race. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, maybe they
Absolutely.
could have expanded on that a little bit more, but I never really felt like they used her race in a way that was like harmful to the show.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
that's just my opinion. I honestly didn't really, I haven't thought too much about it, but maybe there is more to that.
Yeah. So we come to the end, talk about the finale a little bit, but let's round it out. For me, I thought it was one of the most satisfying endings that I've seen in a lot of shows because some of the storylines were completed, but also things were like kind of left unlabeled, like Towns' relationship. They don't close everything up, I think, which is kind of, I think, the better option. And like some relationships and her next steps, they don't really get into too much. They also, I think, give a lot of hope for her future because that chessboard appears back up on the ceiling, and you kind of answer that question. It wasn't the drugs, it wasn't the alcohol. She had it in her all along. And she realizes it at that point that it was me all along. I really loved that. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I like the ending a lot because I think it kind of again, I think it really shows her growth. Like she doesn't, first of all, she doesn't need the drugs. Like she doesn't need to feel like this is stressful. She can just like love the sport, and her love and her intellect and her um, basically like how smart she is. That's what drives this. That's what drives her
Hmm.
success. It's nothing else. I think that we finally see that for her. And
Yeah.
she doesn't have to do it for anything else except for herself and what makes her happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I also love how like the costume design was used to show her complete arc. The very end is wearing this hat
Hmm.
that kind of makes her look like a queen. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, so in the beginning, I think in her orphanage days, she was kind of dressed up with very drab clothing, like very gray and almost like a pawn. And by the end, she's wearing this hat that makes her look like a queen, signifying that journey that only a few pawns make across the chessboard to go from that lowly pawn to a powerful queen. That was always what I wanted to do during chess games. I was desperately trying to get that pawn across the board, and I don't think that was the point my chess professors were trying to make. I think they were trying to make me play like more tactical chess, but I don't know
Yeah.
why. I just wanted that. I wanted multiple queens on the board.
It's
um,
amazing.
so we talked a lot about different misconceptions in the show, what the show did right, what the show did wrong. I love that we got to discuss all of these things through the lens of a TV show. I think it makes more approachable, and for us to kind of discuss it through this lens. Thank you so much for joining me. Well, that's all we have for the Queen's Gambit. Thank you guys so much for listening and letting us nerd out about medicine and the silver screen. I want to thank my special guest here, Dr. Venkat, and you can find her social media info over at our Instagram page at Diagnosing TV. I want to end this first episode with a quote from our another great television series, The West Wing. In the episode H-Con 172, a slanderous book about President Bartlett is about to be published, and he is amused by the amount of misinformation and lies in it. However, his deputy communications director, Sam Seaborn, played by Rob Lowe, is incredibly frustrated and is desperately trying to fact check every single little detail. President Bartlett asks him offhand, "Why does it even matter?" And he responds, "Because I don't think it's such a good idea to be casual about the truth." Thank you. Until next time.